A nefarious, disguised mugger prowled the American South during the early decades of the 20th century, straddling a murky line between real-life criminal and folklore. Today on American Strangeness, the haunting history of the Gown Man. While recently investigating the strange case of the monster of Marmot Street, also known as the Mary Shelley inaccurate Frankenstein of Fisher's Alley, I came across another strange character that once prowled the same streets in North Mobile, Alabama. One newspaper compared the hysteria surrounding the Marmot Street monster of February 1938 to the Gown Man who once stalked Davis Avenue, draped in white and terrifying pedestrians. Who was this Gown Man? I needed to find out, and I was surprised to uncover that he was a presence who haunted the Mobile area not just once, but multiple times throughout several decades. And it went beyond Mobile. I soon learned that the Gown Man was a specter deeply entwined with the entirety of the American South, ever present in the shadowy subconsciousness of its residents. Before we continue, I want to touch on a conundrum that sparks a continual wrestling match within my brain. One challenge in writing about these events in North Mobile is the fact that early 20th century news articles aren't exactly known for their racial sensitivity. As North Mobile was a predominantly black community, the articles about the Gown Man and the monster of Marmot Street routinely underline that fact. Many articles were written neutrally, although they used now outdated nomenclature. But some articles dripped with ugly and obvious racism, and it's rather shocking to see today. It's also blatant that some of these stories were painting black residents as superstitious and excitable. Of course, that scene plays out throughout time in news stories about mass hysteria surrounding various mysterious fiends, no matter the town or its demographics. As a writer who obsessively cites his sources, I struggle with even stating the headlines of some of these old news articles. Should I present the citations as they were, or strike out offending words, as I currently have done in my list of sources, which you can find in the description of this video? Within my presentation, I try to avoid references to more objectionable content unless absolutely necessary to convey the correct historical context. That is hard to ignore in presenting this topic, which explores a possibly folkloric phenomenon documented in black communities throughout the American South during the late 1800s and early 20th century. In any case, it's just a reminder that history isn't very pretty, but you disparage truth if you ignore it. During the winter panic over the Frankenstein of Fisher's Alley in 1938, the Pensacola Journal stated on January 29th that not since the notorious Gown Man of Davis Avenue had there been such a scare in the primarily black neighborhood of North Mobile. The menace had appeared clad in white and frightened the wits out of his victims. This particular Gown Man was likely a reference to John Coleman, an African-American man who terrorized hundreds of residents along Davis Avenue several years earlier before his capture and arrest. The Pensacola Journal stated that the Gown Man was a thief who had been sentenced to a stint in the penitentiary, although this could have been a blurred memory of an earlier Gown Man, Willie Taylor, who was a purse snatcher given hard labor for his crimes. Coleman was more of a prankster, whose modus operandi during both of his two tenures as the Gown Man was to accost pedestrians, raise his overcoat over his head, make faces, and shout "boo." The cops preferred a vagrancy charge for Coleman, who paid a $10 fine for the offense in police court. But this was just the latest adventure for Mobile's Gown Man. And here's a historical note. Davis Avenue, which has been renamed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue, is celebrated in the present day for its role during the 1940s through the 1970s as Mobile's Black Main Street, in quotes, a hub of black-owned businesses and venues, and a walkable and tight-knit community with dense activity, according to the Alabama Contemporary Arts Center. To learn more about the Gown Man, we need to travel further back in time, starting on December 10th, 1927. Per a report in the New Orleans States, Mobile's police force was on the hunt for the Gown Man, a mysterious night prowler who has terrorized residents in the northern part of the city and shifted to a different locality. Passing motorists and a resident of the St. Charles Apartments spotted the quote-unquote apparition and alerted police, putting them on the trail early that morning. Police ultimately admitted failure after the curious figure of the much-wanted intruder disappeared in the darkness just as pursuing officers reached the spot where he was last reported. Turning back the clock further, we learn that the Gown Man was especially active in Whistler, an Alabama community about 7 miles northwest of Mobile. An article published in the September 29, 1921 Wiregrass Farmer offered a detailed description of the Gown Man, or at least one version of him, and his notoriety. Gown Man appears again. Whistler's Gown Man, the mysterious figure which has appeared for 4 consecutive years in Mobile's suburb, has come back again. The heavily robed figure appeared for the first time this year last Friday, when several Whistler residents saw him go into a pine thicket near the Turnerville Road. The figure was covered by a flowing gown and wore a high hat coming to a point. The stories as told about the Gown Man, as it is known over the section, brand it as a rather harmless specter, but the mystery which surrounds it comes from the fact that it has never been seen at close range. Every time a materialization is made, a crowd is organized to catch it, but after hundreds of these chases, the Gown Man is still free. Every year he appears about the same time, and is glimpsed practically every night until late in the winter. The Gown Man makes a specialty of frightening children, though no record has been made of any harm being done. He seems to take a special delight in appearing suddenly to youths after dark, and the bona fide nature of many a wild chase is attested to by the leading residents of Whistler. Organized effort was made to get the wanderer last year, and on several occasions it seemed to be cornered, but always escaped. One night during last winter, the figure was seen to leap into an empty freight car on a railroad track, but when the pursuers came up to the car, it was empty. There was only one door to the car. Since the reappearance of the Gown Man Friday, Whistler residents have begun a movement to catch the person, and finally get at the bottom of the mystery. Meanwhile, the children in Whistler are keeping pretty close to their homes until the capture is made. Now, looking back, it's hard not to notice the unsettling similarity between the Whistler Gown Man's flowing gown and high hat coming to a point, and the traditional attire of the Ku Klux Klan. According to the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, the original KKK that formed in the wake of the U.S. Civil War wore masks or hoods and sometimes robes, but it was the second version of the hate group, started in 1915, that firmly established the well-known look of the hooded and robed Klans member. The organization formed in Alabama following the Civil War to oppose the extension of citizenship and voting rights to former slaves, as well as ending Republican control of the state government, per the Encyclopedia of Alabama. The KKK disbanded during the early 1870s, but returned in 1915, establishing a Birmingham chapter the following year and expanding statewide throughout the early 1920s. This timing eerily correlates with the emergence of Whistler's Gown Man. Were residents seeing local Klansmen on their way to meetings deep in the woods, or is it just a coincidence? Overall, could the Gown Man phenomenon have reflected fears in the African American community of a very tangible threat that was lurking in the underbelly of the South? Perhaps, but the Gown Man also described in 1921 was a more benign boogeyman, possibly even a non-human phantom. Also, when various gown men were unmasked, they were most frequently black, revealing that the culprit was preying on their own community. The various gown men also wore a variety of robes and women's clothing of different colors, and their activity ranged from pesky to nefarious. As you will see, the Gown Man might represent folklore developed specifically within the African American communities of the South during the late 1800s and the first few decades of the 20th century. In 1920, we come across the very human Gown Man who seems to be at the root of the long-lasting phenomenon. On July 24th, Willie Taylor was paraded before Mobile Police Court wearing the blue gown, black bonnet, and mask in which he had been captured. North Mobile residents testified that Taylor was indeed the figure who had been terrifying the residents of Davis Avenue for several weeks. Taylor's specialty was purse snatching, and he had been arrested on the complaint of such by one of his recent victims, Irene Hawkins. Even worse, Taylor had allegedly frightened and robbed children who had been sent to local stores on errands. Taylor was convicted of his crimes and given a year of hard labor. Was Taylor the original Gown Man whose exploits became urban legend around Mobile and fueled stories of more evasive robed strangers in subsequent years? Perhaps he inspired later gown men like John Coleman. Possibly, but Taylor's arrest was just a bump in the road for the Gown Man, whose history in Mobile stretched back decades. On November 2nd, 1900, Mobile police were looking for a man in a Mother Hubbard dress, which is a long, wide, loose-fitting gown with long sleeves and a high neck, who had disturbed the peace and serenity of the western portion of the city and prevented many from staying out late for fear of coming in contact with the mysterious individual, wrote the New Orleans Times-Democrat. Police planned to redouble their efforts to discover and make known this individual's identity, as well as the object he could have been masquerading out of season. Mobile police provided an update 6 days later, which also might be the first time the ominous character was referred to as Gown Man. As reported in the Times-Democrat, Chief Seuss, believing that the Gown Man is being used as a subterfuge for disorderly persons to carry guns, has issued some orders on the subject. He states that his detectives have investigated the subject and found the Gown Man to be a myth, and there is more danger from the gangs hunting the Gown Man than from the imaginary gentleman. The reference to a mob searching for the Gown Man reflects the posse of armed vigilantes that patrolled North Mobile looking for the monster of Marmot Street in 1938 and had to be dispersed by police lest someone get shot. Even if the original Gown Man was a myth, there is evidence that he permeated local popular culture. Mobile had its Mardi Gras festivities on February 19, 1901. During the parade, the Comic with 2 M's Cowboys presented 8 humorous floats portraying local events, themed Mobile's expansion. These floats were titled Return of Our Mystics, Miss Nation and the City Ordinances, the Mobile Press Baseball Club to the Rescue, Mobile New Year's Caller, Public Library, Alabama's Motto, New Union Depot, and the Gown Man. Newspapers outside of Mobile reported on the Gown Man, and he would appear in cities throughout the South in the coming years. Did these news articles implant the idea in the head of readers in other states, or could it mean that the Gown Man was a wider phenomenon? As you will see in the next part of this video, the answer is that there were multiple other Gown Men operating throughout the American South, and under a variety of nicknames. Next time, we will explore the precursor to the Gown Men, the Hugging Mollies. See you then.